Hello and welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the strange and curious corners of Ireland and Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and in this episode I'm taking you a little further afield than usual, to a part of the world that gets a lot more sun than Ireland is used to. This is the story of a Caribbean island where Irish was natively spoken in the 19th century, where St. Patrick's Day is celebrated each year with a week-long festival. Though in truth, that's as much to remember the sins of the Irish as it is to celebrate Irishness. It's an island with a population smaller than most Irish towns, that most people would never have heard of if not for its tragic recent history. This is the story of Montserrat. Like most Caribbean islands, Montserrat was probably settled and abandoned many times before records began. In fact, there is evidence of activity on the island at least 500 years BCE, and possibly even 2,000 years BCE. There were other settlements over the centuries, but by the time it was discovered by Europeans, the island was abandoned. That was by Christopher Columbus on his second voyage to the area, and he was told by the locals that it was empty because it was too vulnerable to being raided. He was the one who named it Montserrat, after a mountain in Spain. Montserrat means serrated mountain, and Columbus might have seen a similarity in the jagged volcanic hills in the south of the island. England began contesting control of the West Indies with Spain around the start of the 17th century, with their first permanent colony being established in the island of St. Kitts in 1627. In 1632, the governor sent a group of Irish settlers, possibly former indentured servants, to Montserrat to found a colony. They set themselves up as smallholders, working independent farms. They were soon joined by more Irishmen from Virginia, though these were mostly Anglo-Irish Protestants, and they were a lot wealthier. 1665, England conquered Jamaica, which knocked the Spanish out of the running and left the English with the French as their only rivals for control of the Caribbean. At the time, the two countries were on opposite sides of the Second Anglo-Dutch War. It's claimed that the Irish inhabitants of Montserrat invited the French to come and conquer it, just as the Irish rebels invited French invasions of Ireland. Whether they did or not, France did invade and occupied the island in 1666, though they handed it back to the English after the Treaty of Breda in 1667 brought an end to the war. This helped to secure the English control of the region and allowed them to begin exploiting the islands in earnest. This meant that, like most of the New World, the islands were subject to the plantation system. This was a process where labour-intensive cash crops were grown in the island, with slaves from Africa used as human fuel to power the engines of production. By 1673, the island had been almost entirely transitioned to sugar farming. A census was carried out in 1768. This showed that 78% of the island's population consisted of free citizens of Irish descent. Many of them were indentured labourers on the plantations, working alongside African slaves. But unlike their African comrades, they didn't have the risk of being sold off into other plantations and having their families broken up at their masters' whims. Those masters, incidentally, were almost all Protestant Irish families. The sugar industry would continue to grow until it reached its peak around 80 or 90 years later. At that time, the industry exported over 3,000 tons of sugar a year, the result of the labour of over 10,000 slaves. The slaves made up around 90% of the island's population at that point. The Irish labourers had either worked off their indenture and moved away, or had become overseas of the slave labour themselves, or they had fallen victim to the notoriously deadly sugar farming industry. That industry continued to be fueled with African slaves, shipped in as quickly as they died. This was why Thomas Russell, co-founder of the United Irishmen, refused to eat anything made with sugar. He said, "Every time I look at a lump of sugar, I see a drop of African blood." With their lives so brutalized, it's not surprising that the enslaved would sometimes attempt to free themselves. Montserrat's most notable attempted rebellion took place in 1768. A slave named Cujo planned an uprising for the 17th of March, St. Patrick's Day, since he knew that the Irish overseers would almost all be drunk. The plan was for the slaves to storm the main government building and grab whatever weapons they could, and to rely on their overwhelming numbers to win the day. It was an audacious plan, but one with some obvious flaws. The most serious of these was that the plan needed a large number of slaves to be aware of it. This made secrecy almost impossible. Inevitably, the plans were leaked. Cujo and 8 other men were hanged, and Cujo's head was displayed in public as a gruesome reminder of the consequences of rebellion. The rulers did their best to quash the memory of the revolt, and it was all but forgotten until the 1970s. Jumping forward temporarily, in 1985 the local government decided to capitalise on this bit of history with a festival that would celebrate both the island's Irish heritage and the resilient desire for freedom of the slaves. They held a week-long celebration, melding together both Irish and African traditions. This attracted some attention and tourism to the island, including from the Irish scholar and politician Michael D. Higgins. At the time, the future president of Ireland was a senator who used his position to highlight issues on the global stage. Notably, in 1982, he had visited El Salvador to expose a massacre by the US-backed government against civilians as part of the Civil War. His visit to Montserrat was much less harrowing, and he formed a deep connection with the people of the island. In 1986, he wrote and presented a documentary for Channel 4 about Montserrat called The Other Emerald Isle. This wasn't the end of his association with the island, but first let us return to the 18th century again. In 1782, the island was captured by France for a second time. This was as part of the American Civil War, as France was ravaging England's Caribbean holdings to draw their navy away from their American allies. They had no intention of holding on to the island, and once again they returned it to English control in 1783 as part of the treaty that ended the war. 4 years later, an alliance of English businessmen formed the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. This was a peaceful group that worked to shift public opinion on slavery through showing people how awful it was for the enslaved. They were successful, and in 1807 the slave trade was outlawed in the British Empire. No new slaves were shipped to the Caribbean, but the slaves there would not be freed for another 30 years. In 1834, the Slavery Abolition Act ended the practice throughout most of the British Empire, and luckily for the people of Montserrat, most included them. Freedom was not absolute at first, however. For anyone above the age of 6 years old, they were designated as apprentices, with a legal status similar to the indentured servitude of the Irish who had come to Montserrat originally. For between 4 and 6 years, they would still have to carry out up to 45 hours of unpaid labour each week. It was during this apprenticeship period that Joseph Sturge first came to Montserrat. Joseph Sturge was born in 1793 to a Quaker family in Gloucestershire, England. In 1822, he and his brother Charles founded a grain import company in Birmingham that was very successful. In 1831, Joseph stepped back from running the business to devote himself to the cause of abolishing slavery. He had been involved in the movement for many years at this point. In 1823, he had been one of the founding members of the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery throughout the British Dominions, better known as the Anti-Slavery Society. As the longer name would suggest, the Society initially advocated for a gradual process of phasing out slavery in the empire. However, many of its younger members, including Joseph, pushed for the immediate ending of the practice instead. After he left his business to be run by his brother, Joseph joined up with firebrands like George Stephen to try to move the society in this more radical direction. To do this, they founded the Agency Committee within the Anti-Slavery Society. In 1832, this group broke away and renamed itself as the Agency Society. The Agency Society had two main goals. The first was to actively campaign for Parliament to pass a law ending slavery. The second was to block the campaigning by landowners and colonial governments from the West Indies, who wanted to keep slavery in place. For example, when those interest groups started putting billboards up around London about the supposed benefits of slavery to the empire, the Agency Society would follow them around and immediately cover the billboards up with anti-slavery posters. They also toured around the United Kingdom, lecturing against slavery, and inspired the founding of over 10,000 local anti-slavery societies. All of this was a key factor in the passage of the Anti-Slavery Bill in 1834. Although the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery regarded the passage of the law as victory, the Agency Society had some serious problems with it. The main two were the apprenticeship period, which we mentioned before, and the fact that slave owners would receive compensation for the freed slaves from the public purse. This was morally outrageous to people like Joseph Sturge. The idea that someone who had exploited the enslaved and benefited from their labour should now be paid for the inconvenience of losing that free labour was abominable. And it was, of course. But it was also an unfortunate economic reality that without some form of compensation, the economic shock to the empire would have been untenable to those in charge. In addition, English law had always held the value of property to be higher than that of human lives in terms of the punishment for harm to either, so compensation remained part of the bill. They had more success in their push against apprenticeships and indentured labour by former slaves, which they rightly regarded with a lot of suspicion. It would have been easy for this to be exploited to continue slavery under another name. The initial version of the bill set the length of it at 12 years. This was reduced to a maximum of 6 years in the final version. It was to observe the apprenticeship scheme in action that Joseph Sturge first travelled to the West Indies in 1834. He interviewed many former slaves and published the details when he returned to London. He made a second trip in 1836, and that was when he first visited Montserrat. He returned to England and successfully completed his campaign against the apprenticeship scheme. Some landowners had been pushing to have the length of apprenticeships set back to the original 12 years, but by demonstrating that it was still being treated as slavery on the ground, Joseph was able to drive Parliament into passing a new law in 1838 that abolished the scheme and gave full emancipation to all former slaves. By now, Joseph had become a plantation owner himself, though a very different one from most others in the West Indies. In 1837, he bought one of the plantations in Montserrat and named it Alberton after the town where he was born. This was intended to show that plantations could still function without slavery, though we realized quickly that sugar was no longer a viable crop. This was not just because of the abolition of slavery. The first sugar beet factory had opened in 1801 in Germany. The Napoleonic Wars blocked Caribbean sugar from reaching Europe, and this drove a switch to beets. By 1840, 5% of the world's sugar came from beets. By 1880, it was over 50%. The rise of industrial farming in the 20th century would swing the pendulum back to sugarcane, but that was well in the future. The plantation owners had seen the writing on the wall, which is why Joseph had been able to buy Alberton cheaply. In fact, all of them sold up and left the island, with most of the plantations being sold off to the locals as smallholders, thanks to funding from English abolitionists. The rest were bought by those same abolitionists who tried to find an alternative crop for the island. First, this was a series of failures. The most notable was when silkworms were imported from Europe and mulberry was grown to feed them. This failed, probably because the island wasn't humid enough. An earthquake in 1843 damaged the buildings and roads on the island, setting things back even further. It wasn't until 1852 that Francis Burke, a local man, found the crop that would keep the island going for the rest of the century: limes. Lime is actually a category of fruit rather than a specific plant, so to clarify, the variety grown in Montserrat were key lime trees, which originate in Southeast Asia. They were perfect for the climate and had a ready market as well in the British Navy. Citrus juice was vital for long journeys, as it prevented scurvy and was easily preserved. This was usually provided by lemons, but in 1853 the Sicilian lemon crop failed, and that led to a shortage on the market. Limes grown in Montserrat were suddenly in demand, and in 1869 the Sturge family established the Montserrat Company Limited in order to produce and export lime juice. By 1895 it was shipping out over 100,000 gallons a year. Joseph had died in 1860, and his daughter Sophia had inherited his estate. The company was a family affair, with other members of the Sturge family buying land to produce limes for it. This was helped by the fact that a lot of the machinery that had been used for sugar could also be used for producing lime juice. Mills, boilers and stills, as a colonial report from 1897 put it. Lime oil was another important product of the process, as it was used for scenting soaps. By 1899, almost half the land on the island was owned by the company. The other half was owned as small holdings for producing their own food by company workers. There was still a clear social stratification on the island between managers and workers, but overall Montserrat looked like it was a success story for industry after slavery. And then, not for the last time, natural disaster came to Montserrat. In August of 1899, a hurricane formed in the Atlantic Ocean off the west coast of Africa. This was not unusual, and in fact this would be the third hurricane of the year. What was unusual was its strength and how long it would last for. In fact, it remains to this day the longest-lasting Atlantic hurricane in history. It would also turn out to be one of the most deadly, killing over 3,800 people. It's usually named as Hurricane San Siracao, named after a Christian martyr of the 4th century. The hurricane travelled northwest across the Atlantic Ocean. When it reached Puerto Rico on the 8th of August, it was blowing at speeds up to 140 miles an hour. Over the course of the next week, it travelled across the West Indies, striking several islands, including Montserrat. The damage to infrastructure and trees put an end to the Montserrat lime industry, though that was far from the worst of the damage. 100 people were killed in the winds, out of a population of only 12,000, and virtually every building on the island was destroyed. At the dawn of the 20th century, Montserrat found itself having to rebuild and reinvent itself again. One of the ways the island did this was by falling back on a crop often associated with plantations and slavery: cotton. Not just any cotton, Sea Island cotton. This is a variety of South American cotton that has been bred specifically to thrive in the West Indies. And though it's never been one of the main products of the region, it's become successful as a luxury brand. A large part of this is due to the works of Ian Fleming. He was a fan of Sea Island cotton, and so he made his creation, James Bond, a fan as well. This is still one of the major selling points of the variety, and it continues to this day, with Daniel Craig wearing shirts made of sea cotton in his Bond appearances. Montserrat was not the main producer of the cotton, but it got a good reputation for the quality of its product. As time went on, the island diversified its economy. While it wasn't one of the wealthiest countries in the world, it did okay for itself. The world wars of the 20th century barely touched the island, though men from there did serve in the British Army. One of the most famous was the RAF pilot Osmond Randolph Kelsick, who was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. There's a portrait of him in the RAF Museum in England. The years after the war, the thoughts of some in the West Indies turned to independence. The first step towards this was the Federation of the West Indies. This was an attempt to unify the islands while granting them a measure of independence, similar to what was happening in Canada to the north. Officially, they had been under a single British governor since 1871, but in practice this had little meaning. It did colour how Britain thought of them, though, and that is why in 1956 they passed a law creating the West Indies Federation. It officially came into existence in 1958 and consisted of 10 provinces. Montserrat was one of those provinces. With a population of 13,000 people, it was the smallest of them. Jamaica, the largest, had over 1.5 million. And it was that imbalance that would doom the Federation. Over half the population and half the land of the Federation were part of Jamaica, and over half the remainder was held by the province of Trinidad and Tobago. Arguments over the site of the provincial capital delayed the Federation getting full independence. This further frustrated Jamaicans, as the main reason they had joined was because they had been told this would be a quicker route to that goal. As a result, in 1961 they left the Federation and got their own independence in 1962. There was an attempt to keep the Federation going, but it was clear that without Jamaica it was no longer a viable product. Over the following years, the various provinces either gained independence or chose to remain part of Britain's overseas territories. Montserrat chose the latter, though it did gain self-governance, with the structure it had set up in the Federation as a province continuing in place. There was talk of declaring their independence, but it never materialised. By the 1980s, Montserrat was a sleepy, almost idyllic Caribbean island. Light industry and tourism were the main employers, but as one might expect from an island around a tenth the size of Ireland's smallest county, none of those were very substantial, nor did they really need to be. The most famous thing about the island was its role as a getaway for music acts. In 1979, George Martin, best known as the producer for the Beatles, built a residential music studio on the island. It was near his house, which was named Ulverston House and had once belonged to Joseph Sturge. Dozens of famous acts recorded albums in the studio, including Dire Straits, Elton John, Lou Reed, Black Sabbath, and Duran Duran. The last band to record there were the Rolling Stones in 1989, as the studio was damaged by a hurricane shortly thereafter. George Martin chose not to reopen it, as it had become harder to persuade labels to finance recording there. Still, many people had fond memories of their time on the island, and would later come together to support it when the sleeping giant finally awakened. On the 18th of July 1995, the volcanic Soufriere Hills in the southern part of the island began to show signs of activity. Underground explosions and jets of steam gave warning that an eruption was imminent. By the 21st of August, these explosions had begun to rain debris on the town of Plymouth, the island's capital. Almost half of the people on the island lived in the town. The residents were evacuated, but they returned on the 2nd of September. They were evacuated again temporarily for December, and finally in April the town was indefinitely abandoned. This was because pyroclastic flows, streams of superheated gas and debris, had begun to descend occasionally from the volcano's summit. Over the following year, the island's residents tried to live their lives around the restrictions caused by the eruptions. Many of them were living in temporary shelters, hoping that they could return to their own homes. But on June 25, 1997, those hopes were dashed. The volcano's dome collapsed, releasing a massive pyroclastic flow that killed 19 people and destroyed 9 villages. The entire southern half of the island was abandoned. A wise decision, as an even bigger explosion and pyroclastic flow happened at 3 a.m. on the night after Christmas Day. This one buried the whole of Plymouth in volcanic ash. It's still uninhabited, as the ash has set like cement, burying the town beyond any hope of repair. Volcanic activity continued into the 2010s, and the southern half of the island is only just starting to be opened up again. All of this had a devastating effect on the population of the island. The loss of Plymouth and so much of the island destroyed their economy, and more than half the population emigrated. They were allowed to settle in London, and citizens of the island were automatically granted indefinite leave to remain in the UK. There were several charitable events organised to benefit the island, the most notable being Music for Montserrat. This was a concert at the Royal Albert Hall organised by George Martin. Many of the artists who had previously recorded in Montserrat performed, and all did so for free. Martin also did several other things to raise money for the island, such as selling limited edition Beatles memorabilia. All in all, he raised several $1 million, which went towards building facilities in the north of the island to replace those lost in Plymouth. Ireland also contributed money to the island, thanks in large part to the efforts of Michael D. Higgins to draw attention to it. The Irish League of Credit Unions, for example, donated $100,000 to the island's credit union to keep it afloat. Despite all of this charity, though, it was the intervention of the British government that kept the island viable. This was not without some reluctance. Some of them wanted to evacuate the island entirely, but there was no real justification for this. Even now, it's largely thanks to the British subsidies, over half the island's budget, that it remains functional. That and the sizable part of the Montserratian people living and working in London and sending money back to the island. In 2016, the then Prime Minister, Donaldson Romeo, joked that the diaspora had brought the island even closer to Ireland in spirit. Despite everything nature has thrown at it, Montserrat endures. They're even building a new capital for the island now, in the north coast. If they're a child of Ireland, then Ireland should be proud of them. But we shouldn't forget the sins of the Irish on the island as well. Slave owners and overseers, or free men who turned a blind eye to the injustices of the system. It's this dual heritage that the island's celebration of St. Patrick's Day embraces. Maybe it's something we should remember for ourselves as well. This has been Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. If you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.